Welcome, good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to join us for this conversation with David Brooks on the new structure of adulthood. I'm Diana Petty, the director of the University of Chicago Leadership and Society Initiative, and I'll offer just the briefest of context to tee up this exciting conversation. To start at the very beginning, LSI is based on a two-part premise. First, life and health spans are getting longer, and increasingly people are having engaged, active years into their 70s, 80s, and perhaps in the near future, even beyond that. Second, societal issues are more complex and interconnected than ever before, and there's an opportunity and arguably a big benefit to growing an advanced leadership force to help drive meaningful solutions on pressing economic, social, and environmental needs. As such, LSI works at two scales, the individual and the societal. Our learning journey creates a methodological approach to support distinguished individuals in a transitional moment toward leading more meaningful, connected, and fulfilling lives, and to help society by equipping these individuals with the knowledge, tools, and networks to drive significant positive social impact. It will be no surprise if you know his work that these two scales align perfectly with the thought leadership of David Brooks. Even before his formal involvement with LSI, his expertise was influential in our vision for the program. And after reading his work in The Second Mountain and The Road to Character, we immediately saw these themes as central to the reflection, exploration, and visioning we could offer through LSI. We are, of course, immensely fortunate that he is an alumni and longtime leader of the university, and in UChicago fashion, he takes an intentionally interdisciplinary approach and brings practices of humanistic inquiry into a process of better understanding ourselves and our own life stories, as well as making sense of our collective human experience and the ways society shapes us and we shape society. In particular, his commentary brings into question how we might formulate a moral vocabulary for ourselves and for society to all connect to a more virtuous humanity. All of David's teachings come together to point to an approach for shaping one's quest for a purpose-driven life, vision for connecting to something greater than oneself, and discerning what we might want to be remembered for. In a recent dinner with the inaugural class, David raised that theologian Frederick Buechner defines your calling as the place where your deep gladness and the world's deep hunger meet. This, among other things, was a reminder how much he shaped our thinking on what next chapters of purpose can look like at this stage of life, and made us more excited than ever for his work with the Fellows to unfold. So from being a scholar we deeply admired, to joining as a formal advisor to the program, to soon teaching with the inaugural cohort in just 8 weeks, but who's counting? We are extremely humbled for the ways in which David has helped LSI frame this unique and exceptional stage of life, and how to go on a journey to understanding where your individual purpose could meet the world's need. So thank you, David. Before we get into the meat and potatoes, a bit of housekeeping and quick sketch of what you can expect for our next hour together. The next 30 minutes of this session will be a fireside chat with David Brooks on the new old age. Then we're fortunate to have two current LSI Fellows, Bob McGonigal and Susan Hairston, briefly share their journey into this next stage of life. And in the remaining 15 minutes, we will invite audience questions. Throughout our conversation, we welcome you to place your questions as we go in the Q&A box that you see on your Zoom screen, and then we'll address those in the closing 15 minutes of Q&A. It's also worth noting that we are recording today's session, and we'll circulate that recording to all attendees in the days ahead. So with that, I am pleased to introduce our moderator for this conversation, Dean Seth Green, who has been a visionary in bringing midlife transition programs to the university and the decanal sponsor of LSI, and of course, a man who needs no introduction, David Brooks. Thank you, Seth and David, and looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Diana, and thank you for the instrumental role you have played as the leader of our Leadership and Society Initiative. And David, let me start by echoing what a tremendous privilege it is to have you involved in LSI. And as someone who's been a fan of yours for decades, let me also just say what an extraordinary privilege it has been for me to get to know you and to learn from you. When you're fans of people, sometimes getting to know them really well can make you less. And in your case, it has made me even more of a fan because I've seen how these ideas that you write about play out in your life, in your own approach to teaching, and in the way that you treat others, including those around you like me. So thank you for being such a big part of our world here. And we want to start with a piece that you wrote in The Atlantic last year called The New Old Age, where you laid out that there is a whole new structure of adulthood and where you set the table for really what LSI and other initiatives are trying to do, which is to make that new chapter of adulthood meaningful and impactful. And I'm curious if, just to set the table for the rest of our discussion, you could just give a snapshot of the ideas in that piece, and then we'll dive into specific elements over the course of our conversation.
Yeah, well, our conceptions about human life. First, thanks for the nice words. I went to college for 4 years at the University of Chicago. I don't think I was complimented once, and so now I'm happy to be so charmingly received. Our conception of human life is kind of fluid, and as many people know, our concept of childhood didn't exist until the Middle Ages. They just didn't see children as that different. They had no interest in child psychology, for example. And then the concept of adolescence, that really is a 20th century thing. It sort of is first thought of in the early part of the 20th century, but it doesn't really come into vogue until about 1948 with the start of 17 magazine. The idea that there's a phase between childhood and adulthood. And think of the huge changes in society wrought by the acknowledgement of adolescence. And so I think we're in another moment like this, not me alone. A lot of people think this, that there's some new phase between retirement, the main career phase, and old age. When you're 60, if you're 60 right now, you have a 50% chance of reaching 90. So that's 30 years and probably 20 or 25, as Dana said, of vibrant years. I think they're amending the Constitution, so you have to be 75 to run for president. And so this new phase is under institutionalized. People enter it, and it's a cultural shift. I mean, the simplest way, and we can talk about this more, the simplest way to talk about this shift in psychology and culture as you enter this age is not just an extension of your career. And I think the simplest way, and I was reading a study about this week, is to rely on a category psychologists call locus of control. And when you have what they call an external locus of control, other people are basically telling you what to do. When you have an internal locus of control, you found your own desires, your own motivations, you're living out of your own set of priorities. And moving from the career phase to what we can call the encore phase is moving from an external locus of control where your employer is telling you what to do to internal locus of control. And about half the increase in well-being is because you get to control what you want to do. This downside is you get to control what you want to do, and you've got to figure out what do I want. And finding our own desires is sometimes a tricky thing.
Well, so I'm eager to give our community here a little bit more of the richness of this phase, maybe doubling down on that idea of what does it look like to move to that internal control. And there are a number of examples that you write about in the piece and that you have shared in other contexts. And I'm curious if you could just maybe think of a few stories that capture for you the possibilities of this new stage of life and what it means and what it looks like as you move from that external to internal locus of control.
Yeah. So for the piece, I interviewed a lot of people who were on the verge of retirement who were thinking about it. And I found, especially for those who are in business, there was a great deal of terror involved in the process. One CEO said to me, I fear two things in life, retirement or death. And I fear retirement more. And somebody said, I right now I have 200 close friends, but when I retire, I'm going to have 5 because all the people in my firm, suddenly they won't be as responsive as they would. I ran into another woman, a friend of mine who was 70, retired from a big arts job. And she said, I really had trouble trying to decide. I realized I'm not very good at predicting what will make me happy. That she had all these plans for retirement. And it turns out when she actually retired, they just weren't fun. And so she had to find something else. So what interests me about this is it's really a cultural change. We grow up in the meritocracy. We have an instrumental mindset. We're all about acquisition. We're about building. We're about effectiveness. We're about productivity. And then you really have to adopt an entirely different layer of consciousness in this phase. And it takes a process and it takes a time. And so for the Atlantic piece, I interviewed a bunch of people who've gone through the programs that already have existed at Stanford, Notre Dame, and Harvard, much inferior programs, obviously, to the LSI. And so, for example, one of my favorite stories was a woman I met and have since gotten to know out in Sonoma County, California, named Ann Kenner. And Ann Kenner was a prosecutor in New York and then a prosecutor in California. And she was a big time prosecutor. She was doing mafia, big drug cartels, and things like that. And when she was in her 50s, her brother, who was really led a troubled life, committed suicide. And it really disturbed her, which surprised her in a way because she hadn't had much contact with him for 30 years, but it really represented a crisis of life. And so she went to Stanford and she said, I thought it would be a sweet little education, but she said, I experienced it as a free fall. Suddenly I had to really reinvent my life. And all the stuff I'd done to build an identity around my resume, all that went out the window. And so she had to go through this process. And she describes these masters of the universe out of Stanford, panicking because suddenly they're no longer big VC guys or tech guys. They're just students. They're college freshmen. And one of the guys she met was having a panic attack on the first day of class because he wasn't used to being the big cheese. And what I liked about her story is that she goes through the program. She discovers how to reveal secrets about her life. Her family had been very secretive, and so she'd grown up in a culture where we just don't disclose. And when I interviewed her, she had written a play about Anne Boleyn, one of Henry VIII's wives, and the San Francisco Theater Company was reading it. And she said it was the most fantastic experience she'd had. It was just so much fun to emote with the actors, then go home and rewrite scenes, then go back and bring it back to them. And the thing I loved that she said was, I can fail big at this. I'm 64. Who gives a shit? And that attitude is what I really loved about her story and many of the stories I heard.
Well, so I'd love to dig in at the conceptual level of that observation. So you have this example of an individual who kind of recasts herself, is internally motivated, is in a sphere that is totally new and isn't necessarily as focused on the traditional definitions of success. I'm curious if we can just take a step back and we think about this stage at an individual and societal level. Let's start maybe at the individual level. What do you see as the new opportunities presented by this stage of life for individuals? And I'm struck, I know you're familiar with Derek Thompson. He writes a lot about workism and how, we have become, over the last few decades, more and more identified with our work, less and less by other kind of social or community institutions, more and more in communities where we're with people that resemble the same workplaces. And you've written about how this could be kind of a whole new chapter for individuals. It can kind of release us from some of those dimensions. And I'm curious if you could just say a bit more about what Anne's story and some of the others you looked at mean at a conceptual level for individuals at this stage of life.
Yeah, I'd written this book called The Road to Character, in which I make a dualism between what I call the resume virtues and the eulogy virtues. And the resume virtues are the things that make you good at your job. And the eulogy virtues are the things they say about you after you're dead, whether you're courageous, honest, capable of great love. And we all know the eulogy virtues are more important, but we live in a meritocracy that focuses on the resume virtues. That if you go to a school, not so much Chicago, but at most schools, and I taught at Yale off and on for 20 years, and the emphasis very much is on your professional life. What are you going to major in that'll be productive? How can you then go on, if you go to a place like Yale, to go into consulting or finance or corporations? And so it's really the whole machinery is built up around that level of professional success, and it has a tendency to eclipse the eulogy, the acts of moral formation. And I used to argue with my colleagues at Yale, like I'd say, the university's job should be to help students become more morally formed. And one of my colleagues said, we don't know how to do that. I was trained as a social scientist. I have no moral knowledge. I'd never been to a faculty meeting where we hired somebody because they were good at moral formation. But as a result, you get a world in which people feel they don't have the moral vocabulary to work on their inner lives. They don't have the moral vocabulary to even think and talk about their inner lives. And in the Atlantic piece, I spoke to a guy in Notre Dame who teaches that program, who describes they had a couple sessions on what's your deepest desire, what is the state of your spiritual life. And he said some of the guys had veins popping out of their necks in that conversation because they were so angry and uncomfortable at having to talk about this deep, dark stuff that's in here. And so to me, what's inspiring about this program, it really is a counteract to the hegemony of the meritocracy. It really is, what is life like when workism is not at the center? And when I interviewed the people for the Atlantic piece, I was genuinely humbled by how much most of them had really left behind their resumes.
Yeah.
That I'm still, when you introduced me just now, I'm New York Times columnist, and I asked them, how often does your old jobs come up? And they said, not much at all. We're not defined by the career we had. We're defined by how we want to serve. And so that strikes me as not only psychologically deepening and liberating, but also socially just very important for our culture, which is the elephantiasis of professionalism and the miniaturization of spiritual and moral life is what we're living through. So I see this both as a personal and social antidote to some of the worst parts of our culture.
And on that latter note, I mean, I just want to give you a chance to go any further because you have written about this possibility that usually movements are started by the young, but here's one that could be started by the wise, and how this could be an antidote that breaks through in some ways to other parts of society. And I'm just curious if you want to say any more about what this means for society, because at LSI, we're very much thinking about individual wellness and impact. We're also thinking about what could this talent pool and this new perspective on life mean for societal enrichment and addressing many of the challenges that we face in our country and in our world.
Yeah. Well, for my whole life, people have been talking about how rotten the rat race is and how we need to get out of it. But nobody ever does anything about it. And so I don't know how old I was when that movie, The Graduate, came out, which made fun of guys who were in plastics and business. And that was a big trope in the 60s. But this is an actual example of people doing something about it, of leading a life that's really not about acquisition. And it could, if this institutionalizes the way I think it will, with schools across the country having programs like this, it really will be some sort of cultural revolution, I think, as people learn to put the career behind. And I'm hopeful. The other thing it will do, I think, is fulfill a need for the young. Because if there's one thing that millennial and Gen Z don't want to do, they don't want to be chained down to a career their whole life. They're a generation that really looks at, frankly, their older brothers and sisters and sees them pulling 18-hour a day work at McKinsey or something like that. And they think, that's not for me. That's not the life I'm going to live. I see it in my own kids. And yet they need role models. They need guidance. And I found teaching. And one of the beauties of this program is you're getting a bunch of people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s back on a college campus, sometimes taking classes with college students. And I found that these students, the young students, have parents, but they need more parents. And they just need more guidance. And the kind of friendship that can blossom between a 20-year-old and a 62-year-old in this circumstances is tremendously powerful. And there's a guy named Mark Friedman who writes about this. That one of the things Mark does is he takes AmeriCorps money, which is go for youth service, and Senior Corps money, which is a program to help seniors serve, and he puts the money together and brings the AmeriCorps people with the Senior Corps people together. And there's that kind of intergenerational service is just tremendously powerful, and it's unleashing a new body of talent to solve social problems.
When I want to take often your point about under-institutionalized spaces, and you've written about this because you've written about how, you mentioned earlier, childhood becomes a category and suddenly is a segment that now we understand with a unique psychology and unique needs and unique resources. Can you talk a little bit about why institutionalizing this space of, second adulthood is so important and why you're viewing LSI, even if only serving maybe a small number of people immediately, as part of that important process of building institutional and almost a whole new reputation for this chapter of life?
Yeah, well, we now live in a society with a whole bunch of under-institutionalized spaces. And so one of them at a younger age is the Odyssey years. It used to be you graduated from school at 18 or 21, and then within a few years you were married, you had a job, you owned a house. Now that doesn't happen until their 30s. And so young people in their 20s are now wandering through their 20s without many structures to help them find their way, and like the army or the church. And it's just much more challenging. And the same as I've described with this encore years, It's just a tough transition. It's a psychological and spiritual transition. And a lot of the people I spoke to, it took more than a year. They thought they knew what they wanted to do when they retired, but then there was this period in the neutral zone where they sort of lost interest in what they thought they were going to do. And it was a process of growth before they figured out what they wanted to do. And so you shouldn't have to do that alone. And one of the, I think, most powerful things about these programs, frankly, is not the people come in and teach, it's the peer relationships. And almost to a person, everybody I interviewed said, the most important part of this program is I'm 65 and now I have 30 new best friends. Who makes 30 new best friends at 65? And so that level of camaraderie, that the institution gives you that structure of 35 or 25, whatever it is, other people who are walking through this with you. But then I think the culture of the institution is super powerful. I saw this interviewing across these programs. They each reflect their own university. Like the Stanford program has much more health and wellness, California. Notre Dame has Catholic social teaching in it. Harvard, it's more social entrepreneur. Chicago, I hope, is more intellectual. Each program reflects the university they're housed in. And so I do think, and as a person whose life was changed by the University of Chicago, I do think there's some institutional wisdom and knowledge that hopefully will be utilized by the students as they come. But I don't come in as I come in to teach in 8 weeks. I don't come in with the illusion that I'm going to walk in there like I can walk into a class of 21-year-olds and wow people with my brilliance. It's going to be a peer relationship with the fellows. And we're just going to, my job as I see it is to ask questions and maybe provide some readings that'll start conversations. It's not to be a lecturer the way I would be for a 21-year-old.
Well, so I'm going to come in a moment to Susan and Bob, who are in that cohort and benefiting immensely from one another. But before we get there, I do want to bring in your insights as a faculty member, David. As you think about teaching in the spring, and we're so excited to welcome you and Anne to Hyde Park and to have you both as professors in our program. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit about what does your syllabus look like and what will your learning journey be like for the fellows? And I know it's going to be very facilitative and, you'll be calling out the wisdom in the room, but I'm curious if you could just give us a glimpse into what your journey looks like for the fellows.
Yeah, our main insight is that we're coming in at the end of the year. And so they'll already have done 2 terms. So I assume the spring is a time when questions are answered. They've asked questions, they've explored, like, what are the answers? And so my conception, I don't know if I've bounced this off you, but my conception is each week we'll ask a big question. And it could be, what's my new narrative? What's my life identity right now? And how has that changed? And we can read, there's a guy named Dan McAdams who actually teaches at Northwestern who studies how people tell their life stories and what are the components you need for a healthy life story. And so I might assign Dan McAdams, or I might assign Ivan Illich, the Tolstoy novel about a guy who led a bad life and didn't discover it until his death. And then another story is, what do I deeply desire? It's actually hard to find out what your desires are. Another question to ask is, how am I called? Where am I called to be? What's my vocation? What, as Diana said, what deep societal problem is it my responsibility to fix? Another one, as we get to the end of the term, just to liven things up in the spring, how do I think about my own death? What legacy do I want to leave? How do I make the transition from what Erik Erikson, the psychologist, call generativity or stagnation? Either I find a way to give back or I stagnate. And then the other question I was thinking of throwing out is, who are my people? Who are going to be the people that are going to be important in this stage of my life? There's a guy named Robin Dunbar, a social psychologist, who says we typically have 5 people in our inner ring, and then 10 people in a middle ring, and then 150 people in a big ring. And we really don't have brain space for more than that. So who am I going to really prioritize here? And for that, I might try to assign a book by Wallace Stegner, the great novelist, called Crossing to Safety, which is about friendship in middle age. And so that would help us think about friendship at this stage of life. So I'm not coming with answers. I'm coming in with hopefully big questions that people will want to think about and answer.
Well, I want to come back to you, David, in a moment, because we have many questions that are lighting up our Q&A. But before we get there, I want to bring in Bob and Susan, because they are, in our minds, case studies of the ideas that we've been talking about. And so as they come on screen here, we will add them so you can see them as well. There we go. Hi, Bob. And
Afternoon.
we'll welcome you as well. Bob, since you are already on screen, let me start with you. As an LSI Fellow, you're on a year-long journey that David just described so aptly. And I'm curious if you could just share a little bit about your background and your motivation to join LSI and to spend a year developing your next chapter. And then we'll ask about some of your aha moments and Susan's afterward.
Sounds great. Thank you, Seth, and thank you for your insights, David. I'm looking forward to the class in the spring and the big questions. I'm currently a full-time student at the University of Chicago. After concluding my professional career on December 31st. Additionally, I proudly have assumed the role of part-time grandfather as of July 28th last year, and I have 8 years of great experience as a dog walker. Now, that delineation of my identity in those capacities, especially looking back at my last 62 years, is really a novel experience for me. Prior to December 31st, my identity would have revolved around being the chief executive officer of a prominent global food supply chain company. Let me give you a little bit of some insights into my background. I come from a middle-income class Irish Catholic family. I'm the youngest of 6 siblings. I grew up and enjoyed a pretty privileged upbringing, shielded from any type of material want. My parents, they were molded by the challenges of the Depression and of World War II, and they instilled in all of us in our family some core values of family, religion, education, and financial security. So I went on, I earned a chemical engineering degree from Penn State. I embarked on a 40-year journey in the food industry, contributed my skills to various organizations. And in my personal life, I've happily married for 36 years. I'm blessed with 2 outstanding adult children. I've got an admirable daughter-in-law, and I have a brilliant 5-month-old grandson, and I have a pretty loyal dog. After achieving, these goals in my current organization, that I've served, I announced that I was going to retire about 2 years ago. And in that last 2 years, I facilitated a transition, seamless transition with a new CEO to take over my leadership role. And about 75% through that, or 6 months ago, in about June, I had, what David highlights as that wave of anxiety of what engulfed me in regarding how would I fulfill my time post-retirement. I still think I'm relatively young. I'm in decent health. My last 4 decades have been dedicated to my family, church, my career. I don't have a lot of personal hobbies. So my motivation to join the Leadership in Society initiative, it stemmed from a coworker nominated me and a compelling phone call right about June of last year. And it was a pivotal moment for me. I discovered I'd been nominated to the inaugural program of the Leadership in Society initiative at the University of Chicago. It intrigued me. I delved into the details, and I learned that this initiative offered me a unique opportunity to spend a year exploring some of my personal values and coming up with some ways to make a positive impact on society, along with some like-minded individuals as myself. The program, appears to be tailored, to align with some pretty important belief that was built in my family and myself, that to whom much is given, much is expected. And that resonates deeply with me. I also recognize, and, I think David highlighted this, the perishable nature of my work relationships and my work experiences. and I aspired to remain relevant in some way after retirements. So 3 months into this transformative experience, I can confidently say that it stands as one of my best decisions that I have made so far in my life, preceding only by proposing to my wife and deciding to start a family. And as I reflect, on the next few months, I'm pretty optimistic that the next 6 months will further reinforce that conviction, that this journey is a commendable and impactful decision for both myself personally, my family, and my societal contributions.
Right. Thank you so much, Bob. And thank you for both displaying the vulnerability that comes at this stage of life, but also the opportunity. I think that, when you can make that transition from the anxiety you may have felt in June to realizing you can release a certain stage of life and enter a new one confidently, it is powerful. And I mean, David, you write in that Atlantic piece that there are these three stages oftentimes. There's this crisis, then there's this neutral, and then there's this kind of whole new rebirth. And I think we're seeing that in our cohort, and it's been beautiful, Bob, to see you going through that. And Susan, I want to come to you, and I'll ask you to share your story.
Well, Seth, first of all, thank you for this opportunity to share about this journey, this adventure that Bob and I are on. And David, thank you for being a thought partner and really being ahead of the curve on this, because I'm a little bit different than Bob in that I came to LSI with a background of service to fellow man forever. I came on the heels of finishing my term as an elected official. I was a city councilwoman for 4 years in Summit, New Jersey, suburban town, about a half an hour outside of New York City. And it was tough being on council during the pandemic and during what I recall as the most mean-spirited time of being in public service ever. And so I have a wonderful, amazing career background of having been in 4 different sectors. I started in the nonprofit sector, and I got lucky and transitioned to answering an ad in the New York Times to go be employed at the Ford Foundation and to be in the grant-making philanthropic space for over 20 years was a dream come true. And as during that entire time, the third sector I was in was politics. I've always been involved as a committee member in my town. But then I actually got elected, and that changed my my job area, and went into business for myself. So that makes me an entrepreneur. And but when I was in politics, because I want to pivot to why LSI, I have just been super unhappy with the trajectory of our country and with the I just the mean-spirited nature of it. And I saw LSI as an opportunity to join forces with an amazing institution like the University of Chicago and a group of like-minded folks who care about the greater good. Now, my personal life has been wonderful, charmed, but very different from Bob's in that as a Black woman, I have suffered the indignities that racism and sexism puts on those of us, and everybody suffers from it, even if it's not geared towards them. But having a very amazing village, which included the church and involvement in nonprofit organizations, community raised me. and has created in me an obligation that I love to give back. What's missing for me is this academic rigor that University of Chicago and brings. And so to bring all of that to bear is an amazing opportunity for me. And I want to speak to what David mentioned about the difference in generations. I've raised 5 children, and I am happy to tell people I'm 62 years old, and I welcome that. And my youngest is 28, and my oldest is 39. And my heroes are my young people, because yes, the wisdom that we bring to them, I also welcome their different kind of passion and their wisdom as well. And so I see that happening for the time that the 3 months that I've been here, being in the classroom with these graduate students has been amazing, Seth. You're right, David. They are kind. They are interested in what I bring and ask really good questions. And it has so far just been an amazing experience. And I think I'll end on that note, Seth.
Well, I want to ask one more question, Bob and Susan, then we're going to come to questions for the panel. And I want to just know maybe one aha moment as you've been working on your purpose plans. Maybe if you could just share, where are you in that purpose plan, one aha moment on your trajectory there, and then we're going to come back to questions for all of you. Bob, can we turn to you first on that?
Sure, Seth. So now remember, this is just after brief span of 3 months. That my purpose plan that I'm working on is a global effort to address food insecurity, specifically around supply chain analytics. And my intention is to leverage some of the skills and experiences I've become reasonably good at, particularly in leadership strategy and supply chain management, to make a tangible and positive impact on food insecurity around the globe. And probably on my purpose plan, what distinguishes, my journey a little bit over these past 3 months is I've taken a little bit of a unique approach to that. And my emphasis has been really to immerse myself into networking and continuously learning from others, about the intricacies of hunger and food insecurity. So, and the support that I have garnered, I think David talked about them being your best friends, and Susan talked about how great the fellows are. They certainly have been my resources, over the last 3 months, and connecting me with different individuals in the community and in the business world, in the nonprofit space, as well as the leaders of the LSI group, Seth, certainly yourself and Diana, and the connection points. And then I've been given a business mentor who's connected me and given me great counsel and guidance. I've talked to more than 25 individuals in the food space. It ranges from food pantries to national food philanthropic groups, to a former UN leader, to an ex-CEO of Procter & Gamble, just over the past 12 weeks. And the most interesting part is everybody that I've talked to, the peers that I have, and certainly LSI Group, are authentically interested in aiding to my future and what I want to get involved in, which I have extremely appreciated. Trying to kind of pick one aha moment, Seth, is a little bit challenging. So indulge me a little bit to give you maybe 3. The exceptional quality of the program has surpassed even my highest expectations. It's just left me in awe. The professors and the program, the way it's structured, has just really left me in awe. The engagement and discussions with the professors and our peers. I've had zero exposure in liberal arts. I took one of those technical degrees, and I haven't had any liberal arts. I avoided when I went to college. I took one English class. That's how I picked my degree, so I wouldn't have to get involved in now. I'm being intellectually stimulated and inspired, with conversations and reading books about Aristotle and Marcus Aurelius and talking about them in a classroom and with the others. So it's been really enlightening to me. And probably my last aha moment, probably the most important one, has been a nightly ritual that I get involved in now, where I share my class experiences and the readings with my wife. And we enjoy a routine of just talking about them. It starkly contrasts to my previous habit of coming home and telling her what sporadically happened at a McDonald's restaurant where I missed the delivery of food products. But her interest and engagement has notably heightened due to the leadership and society initiative experience. We get to enjoy that together.
Thanks, Bob. And Susan, final thoughts, and then we're going to come back to the full panel.
Yes. So my purpose plan and has my vision for it has changed at least 10 times since I've been here, because I actually started my social impact adventure in 2020. And so I came here with an idea that I wanted an evidence-based roadmap that's going to scale my business. Because as I mentioned to you, I have this burning desire to change the world, and I am doing it through my consulting practice, which assists foundations and nonprofits that serve marginalized communities. And so I really have made the plan to be more focused on how am I going to do that, and really taking advantage of the wealth of resources and the centers. When Bob talked about the people that he's met, it is true. There is just a wealth of generosity to share what is going on in the laboratories at University of Chicago, and how they can give ideas about what I am doing in working with foundations to make their operations more user-friendly to nonprofit organizations, and then how nonprofits can understand what foundations expect with keeping the community at mind. And so my aha moment, which was first talked about in the article that David wrote, was how shocking it was to put myself in this space and realize I romanticized going back to school, and that this was a very big hill to climb to get reacclimated. I brought my husband and dog from New Jersey to Chicago, and it was shocking to me to not realize that it is a whole new way of thinking. And thank God for the amazing staff at LSI, because Diana and Shannon and Sarah and Youssef have been amazing at making that transition a smooth one, and where I really absolutely look forward to my coursework. I'm not intimidated by the professors because they do embrace us. And just as Bob said, an awesome decision I made. And yes, Jerome does let me come home and talk about what I'm learning, and even hangs out with me sometime on campus.
Well, we've loved having him on campus, so we've all benefited from him as well as you, Susan. I want to come now to the questions that you all have been populating in our Q&A. And David, I'm going to start with one for you, although Susan and Bob, we welcome your thoughts too. And it's around what readings you might suggest to help people who are thinking about how to approach these years. I'll recommend a reading, which is The Second Mountain, which David, you wrote, and which is really the seminal piece that launched the Leadership in Society initiative. But David, I'll come to you, because I'm guessing with your self-deprecating style, you probably won't recommend that book, but you may recommend others that influence that book, and your current book, How to Know a Person, which I know also delves into these topics in another way in terms of socialization and connection.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to recommend all my books. Kidding. uh, there are some books which I will not assign because a lot of the fellows had already read it. But I always assign for people of any age Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. That it's guaranteed to change about a third of the people who read it. It changes their life. It's about Viktor Frankl's experience in Auschwitz. Other books, again, I wrote a book called The Road to Character, which is about people who were kind of pathetic at age 20 and kind of amazing at age 70. And I wanted to know how midlife change happened. And so one of the books I always assigned was a beautiful book by a Catholic woman named Dorothy Day, a very prominent uh, woman, called The Long Loneliness. And it's sort of about her coming to faith, but it's really about her coming to decide to dedicate herself to a life of service to the poor and living with the marginalized. And it's a beautiful book about spiritual commitment and a life of pure service. And so that's a book when I assign it, people find it just revelatory. And you can be an atheist, you could be Jewish. Dorothy Day will speak to you. Another book I'm just thinking about today was a biography of Samuel Johnson. And Samuel Johnson was the 17th century essayist. He compiled the first English dictionary. Again, kind of pathetic at age 20. But he really wrote himself to greatness. And he wrote books about his moral heroes and his moral exemplars. He wrote essays about his own sins. He was really bad at envy. He had a great envy problems. He wrote about the sin of envy over and over again. And by the time he died, he was really a magnificent man, just lavishly generous, took in all sorts of people who were struggling to live with him, prostitutes, people who had been shamed, and really was something approaching a secular saint. And so, we learn by example and by models. And so a lot of the books that come to mind immediately are biographies of people who have really led lives of personal transformation.
Thank you, David. Susan, Bob, any books that have influenced you that you want to name before we go ahead, Susan?
I'm like Bob. I have just been really taken back by some of the readings from Aristotle. I never read any of those, and I was surprised that they were talking about leisure, and so I should be able to list one off. But I'm sorry, I'm not thinking in that mode. And I do want to address, someone asked if this is just a advertisement for LSI. No, I'm not here to advertise. The readings have been so thoughtfully curated and from very different perspectives, and it has opened up my mind in just a wonderfully rich way. And some things are hard to get through, and others have spoke to the why and the what about me as a person, and about my desire to have impact on community. So I think I'll defer to Bob to give some examples of what we're reading. But I can tell you, because we have such a variety, what do we call it, Seth? It's from
interdisciplinary. Yeah, we have all disciplines. We try to bring in
so
every.
we're coming from economics, we're coming from philosophy, and it's been a very cool immersion into different intellectual pursuits.
Bob, anything to add before we go?
Yeah, I think Susan's right. I think anything on Marcus Aurelius and Stoicism, I think was insightful for me, and certainly Aristotle. I would put a pitch in for David's book on how to know a person and the art of seeing others. I had the chance to read that. It was actually recommended to me by my business mentor, I thought it was timely for at least myself in during this transition on how do you really see people, and how do you engage with people, and how do you make yourself present for others, which sometimes I haven't done as much in the past. So I thought it was very impactful for myself.
Another question in the chat, and maybe David, I'll start with you again. For those of us who are heading into the later stages of a career, so they're not yet at this retirement stage, but they're, past their 50s, what advice do you have for shifting more to an internal locus of control and to prioritizing eulogy virtues while managing career, family, etc.? In other words, what can someone who is turning, say, 50 be doing to prepare for their future transition? And David, the reason I want to start with you is I know that you have actually done some of this in your own life. I mean, we've had conversations where you've said, you are trying to care less about that Amazon rating and care more about what you're trying to contribute to the world. And, even though you write about this and you know it intellectually, it's not easy, but, I'm curious if you could just share how you think about this, both as a intellectual and as a person, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I do think of it. I mean, I've had my job at the Times for 20 years. I've had another job I have at the PBS NewsHour I've had for 23 years. I've been writing for the Atlantic since I was 25. So, does the world really need another 500 columns or 1,000 columns from David Brooks? I'm not sure I've written thousands. Is that really the best use of the late stage of my career? And so I've done something which I learned from one of my students. I had a guy in my classes, and at Yale, my classes were partially 20-year-olds, but partially 40-year-old mid-career military. And one of the guys who was a colonel in the Army said, every time I get stationed to a new base, my wife and I take our life back to the studs. And we say, are we happy with our marriage? Are we happy with our parenting style? Are we happy with the Army? And so what he did was he divides his life into 3 to 5 year chapters. And I tell the young people that's a good lesson learned, because asking what's my life is about is too big a question. You can't answer that question. But if you can say, well, if the next 5 years is a chapter in my life, what's the chapter about? And so for those of us who are sort of in late career, though, I think Susan and Bob we're all exactly the same age. But I guess I didn't make enough money to retire. I don't know. But I do think as Dwight Eisenhower said, plans are nothing, but planning is everything. And that to begin to find the problem and to think afresh and to liberate yourself, which is what I'm trying to do right now. My life could be radically different. I've been blessed by a lot of things, and maybe it could be different. And one of the things I've learned from people who are in their 80s, I ask them, is there a risk you took that you regret? And they almost never say yes. They always say, no, every risk I took, even if it didn't work out, I learned something. And so I've tried to, even in late career, begin to widen my horizon of risk, of what's the kind of crazy, stupid thing I may be willing to do.
Thanks, David. Susan and Bob, any additions to that?
Yeah, the only thing I'd add is probably what I didn't do that I would suggest, people in the 50s. You'd be amazed at how many people out there are willing to talk to you about what, activities or what you'd like to get involved in. So I would start the conversations earlier than I did. And whether that's with civic groups or in the community or in your church, but I'd start the conversation as to, hey, I'm interested in doing something different, later in life, and start building those networks. People probably already do that. It was just something I didn't do.
Well, oh yeah, go for it, Susan.
No, I don't have anything I think unique to add, except that I know folks who are not in the high socioeconomic, usually time is a factor. Time is what is very hard to you can't recreate it. And so I say pursuing joy needs to be something at our age we prioritize. And so if with LSI, you absolutely prioritize community and greater good. And those opportunities are available to you through your churches, through civic engagement. And so, but what brings you joy comes from within, should drive that.
Well, we have a few questions in the chat about what this whole kind of new community and new structure of adulthood means for higher education and about how to democratize this space. And David, this is something that you have said a lot about. It's something that you've challenged us to think more about. We're looking seriously at what we can open source within LSI so that we can try to be as accessible and democratic as possible, _D, as we move forward. But I just want to open, there are a number of questions that point at this, common theme, and I want to make sure we answer them. David, if you have thoughts you want to share on the question of what it looks like for, higher education and for institutionalization to be more democratic and accessible in this space.
Yeah, I mean, the programs that I profiled in that Atlantic piece were Harvard, Stanford, Notre Dame, and Chicago. So we've covered the American educational gamut from A to B. And so it right now, but I think everybody in the program, especially you, Seth, understands this is just the beginning. And that I think everybody understands this has to be democratized. And I personally think it can be democratized at relatively low cost. The secret sauce is partly the curriculum and partly the chance to be on campus, but the secret sauce is the fellowship. And so I'm not an entrepreneur, but I'd written in that Atlantic piece, somebody should start a company called Transition Teams, which would gather people together for anybody going through a whole series of life transitions. And you could just go through it with 30 people. And you could meet at a church basement. You wouldn't have to rent Stanford University. And so I do think something like that is bound to happen just because so many people are going through the same searching process at the same time. We just somehow need to cohere it around some set of institutions that's going to serve this. One of the peculiarities of our society is that we used to be really good at creating chapter-based national organizations. So the Elks Club, the Kiwanis Club, the Ladies Auxiliary, even Alcoholics Anonymous, they're local, but they're sort of unified. And so we need a version of that for the transition into the Encore years.
Well, I know we're coming to time. Let me just ask for, and Susan, I want to come back to you. Let me offer it in this way. I want to ask for each of you to share one tip. Let's assume many people in our audience are either coming up to or have reached this point of life. What would you say is, your biggest tip for them as they think about how to design their next chapter? And Susan, will come to you first, and then Bob and David.
Thanks, Seth, for coming to me, because I want David to know he sparked an idea, and it is because I serve on the Community College Foundation board. And that would be another great way to democratize this way of thinking, this new adulthood. And my tip, I gave it. It's joy. And I can't say anything more than that. We at our retiring age need to be prioritizing our health, and joy impacts all of that. So I'm going to stick with it, Seth.
Well, I have a big smile hearing that tip, Susan. Bob?
I would say, if you can understand what's important to you, try to expand your network around it and ask questions within your community or within that group of 5 friends that David speaks about.
Well, and David, I'm going to come to you. I just want to say that it may sound impossible for Susan to be describing joy in the University of Chicago. When you came here, we were the place where fun comes to die. So I just want to, acknowledge that potential challenge for you, or cognitive dissonance, as you hear.
It's a much healthier, psychologically healthier place today than it was when I went there. My tip first would be to think about time differently. And I'd mentioned in the Atlantic piece that I have this productivity clock going in my head all the time. So when I'm meeting someone, I'm always thinking, how many seconds can I really devote to this conversation? And so I've had to learn, and still am in the process of learning, how to think about time differently. So answering the next email is not always on my mind. And then finally, since Susan talked about joy, I'll end there too. And my little thought about joy is that happiness is when you win a victory, you feel big about yourself. But joy is when you lose yourself in something. When you're dancing with your friends and you're being silly, you're not thinking about yourself. I had a professor at Chicago, William McNeil, who said, I experienced joy when I was marching with my unit in World War II. We were just marching in preparation, but somehow doing this together with all the others, I felt a swelling out of myself. There's a great Zadie Smith quote. She's in a club in England, in London in the 1990s, and she's lost her handbag. Her shoes are killing her. And then the song called by a group called The Tribe Called Quest comes on, and some guy just reaches out to her and grabs her hand and says, "Are you feeling it? Are you feeling it?" And she said, "We gave ourselves up to joy. Our head exploded." And she just total release. And so when you look at those images of joy, it's the transition from very self-aware to losing yourself. That's a nice thing to be able to do in one's maturity.
Well, this has been an extraordinary conversation. It's because we've had extraordinary people to converse with. Thank you, David, for your role in seeding LSI, and Bob and Susan, thank you for being our partners as inaugural fellows. And we will share this video. We are very committed to the questions that have been raised around how we make sure that our role is to democratize the space and make sure that more people have access. And so look forward to continuing that conversation with many of you who have raised those questions very thoughtfully in the chat. And David, we look forward to having you in Hyde Park in the spring, and promise good weather by then here in Chicago. Thanks to everyone.
I will see you at Jimmy's.